The Hartfield ballroom held 40 candles in every sconce, and 40 guests in their finest summer dress. And Eleanora Vane, born Hale, married 2 years and acknowledged by no one, stood at the refreshment table with a glass she had not touched and a smile she had worn so long it had become structural. The room smelled of beeswax and cut roses and the particular heat of bodies pressed too close on a midsummer evening. And she had counted the candles because counting was something her hands could do when the rest of her was required to be still. She wore a dress she had made herself from a bolt of ivory silk, purchased with what remained of her quarterly allowance after the east wing roof repair. And it was a good dress. Her stitches were precise. Her father had taught her that much. But it was not a London dress, and the women near the window knew it. Lord Radcliffe's voice carried the way voices do when a man has no particular reason to lower it. And what he said, standing 3 yards from where Eleanora stood, was this: that Hartfield had married the steward's daughter, hadn't he? And one wondered what the alternative had looked like. Sophia Hale, standing beside Radcliffe, touched his arm and smiled. She had her mother's coloring and her father's instinct for timing. And the smile she offered was the kind that suggests the speaker has said something regrettable, but not untrue. Eleanora set her glass on the table. Across the room, she watched her husband hear it. She watched the line of his jaw change. She watched him pour a third glass of claret he did not need and cross the floor toward her, and she understood, with the precision she applied to everything, exactly what was coming, and that there was nothing in the room she could do to stop it. "I should have married your cousin," Alistair said. He said it at a volume he did not intend, or perhaps intended entirely. The claret and the humiliation conspiring toward the same result. He said it looking at her, and she understood that he meant Sophia, who was golden and decorative, and everything Eleanora was not in a ballroom. And she understood also that he had said it in front of 30 people who were now very still and very attentive. Eleanora looked at her husband. She thought of 2 years of managed accounts. She thought of the quarterly reports she had written by hand since the clerk resigned in February, of the March roof repair she had arranged from the discretionary fund because Alistair had been in London and the East Wing could not wait, of the 47 tenant households whose names she knew and whose children's ailments she tracked in the margins of her ledger. She thought of all the rooms she had managed and all the rooms she had been invisible in. And she looked at her husband and she said, in a voice that carried precisely as far as his had, "She's available now. So am I." The sentence entered the room like a key, turning in a lock that no one had known was there. It was not a threat and it was not a plea. It was an offer, perfectly shaped, that placed before Alistair Vane, Marquess of Hartfield, exactly the freedom his cruelty had pretended to want. The room watched. Sophia's expression shifted from composed to calculating in the space of a breath. Alistair did not move. His mouth opened. Nothing came out. The articulate Marquess of Hartfield, who had a barb for every occasion and a sentence for every room, stood before his wife with 30 guests watching and produced nothing. Because every word he had ever used with her had been built to deny something, and the woman in front of him had just made the denial impossible. He did not move. He did not speak. Eleanora set her empty glass on the table and walked toward the corridor door, and the room parted for her as rooms do when a woman has just become the largest person in them. He followed her. She had expected that. The corridor outside the ballroom was cool and dim, lit by a single wall sconce that threw long shadows toward the east staircase. Eleanora had stopped near the window that overlooked the gravel drive, not because she wanted to look at it, but because she needed a wall at her back. and when she heard his footsteps on the stone floor, she did not turn. "You cannot say that," Alistair said. "Not in front of the room, not in front of Radcliffe." "You said it first," Eleanora replied. She turned then, because she would not have this conversation with her back to him. I simply answered, "That is not the same thing, and you know it. I know that Lord Radcliffe made an observation about your marriage," and Sophia smiled at him while he made it. "And then you walked across the room to tell me who I should have been replaced with." She kept her voice level, not because she was calm, but because she had learned, long ago, that level was the only register in which she could be heard. "I answered your question honestly. If Sophia is preferable, she is unmarried and in the room." "That is not what I meant." "Then what did you mean?" He did not answer. He put his hand against the wall and looked at a point somewhere past her shoulder. And she watched him search for the sentence that would make what he had said mean something other than what it meant. And she watched him fail to find it. "I would prefer," Eleanora said, "that we not continue this conversation tonight." She straightened the cuff of her sleeve, a gesture so small and so deliberate that it said everything she had chosen not to say. "I have the tenant quarterly reports to finish before Friday. Good evening." She walked away. She did not wait for his response. Behind her, she heard him say her name once, not a call, more like a word a man uses to test whether a door is still there. And she did not stop. And the corridor swallowed the sound of her footsteps until there was nothing left for him to follow. Back in the east wing, with the ballroom noise reduced to a murmur through two walls, Eleanora opened the wardrobe and took out a trunk. She packed methodically. The practical items first, the account books she had purchased herself, the correspondence folders, the small locked box of her father's letters. Then the personal, the ivory brooch that had been her mother's, the copy of Cowper's poems with her father's annotations in the margins, the blue wool shawl she wore in the estate office on cold mornings because the fire there was unreliable. She packed without haste and without tears because tears would require her to feel things in the wrong order, and she needed to be practical first. Mrs. Calloway found her on the second drawer. The housekeeper was 52 and had run Hartfield's domestic operations since before Eleanora was born. And she stood in the doorway with her hands folded and her expression carefully neutral in the way of women who have seen enough of great houses to know that neutrality is the only safe position. "My lady," Mrs. Calloway said, "your father would not have wanted this." "My father wanted me respected," Eleanora said. She did not stop folding. "He said so the last time I sat with him. He was very specific about it. He said, in those words, that he wanted his daughter respected in the house where she would live." She set a folded blouse in the trunk. "That has not happened. So I am not certain my father's wishes are the most useful guide to tonight's situation." "Where would you go?" The question settled in the room like dust. Eleanora's hands went still on the fabric. "I don't know yet," she said. And because Mrs. Calloway had known her since she was 7 years old and had brought her broth when she had measles and had stood at the back of the church at her father's funeral with tears she had not tried to hide, Eleanora allowed herself to say the rest. "I have no destination. That is the difficulty." She set the packed trunk at the door and returned to the writing desk. The tenant quarterly reports were spread across it. 47 households, half of them written, half of them waiting. She sat down and picked up her quill. "I will finish the report," she said. "Then I will decide." Mrs. Calloway did not leave immediately. She stood in the doorway for a moment longer, and then she said, very quietly, "Your father left something for you. I have been holding it until it was needed." She paused. "I think it may be needed now." "Bring it in the morning," Eleonora said. She bent over the reports and began to write. And the scratch of the quill was the only sound in the east wing, and the trunk sat at the door like a question she had not yet answered. In the morning, Alistair passed the east wing corridor on his way to the stables. The door was closed. Through the gap at the frame he could see the edge of the trunk, dark wood and brass fittings, positioned exactly where someone would put it if they intended to carry it out. He stood in the corridor for a moment with his riding gloves in his hand. He did not knock. Mrs. Calloway brought the box before breakfast. It was small. Rosewood with a brass lock and a key on a piece of ribbon. And she set it on the estate office desk where Eleonora was already working, and said only that Thomas Hale had asked her to keep it until it was needed, and that she judged this to be the moment. Eleonora opened it with the key. Inside, a ledger. 30 years of her father's handwriting, small and precise and utterly familiar. She had learned her own accounting hand from his. She turned the first pages slowly. Column after column of figures, dates, notations in the margins. It took her 4 pages to understand what she was reading. And when she understood it, she set the ledger flat on the desk and placed both hands on either side of it and looked at the numbers without moving. £12,000. Not all at once, that would have been visible, would have required explanation. Instead, year by year, her father had covered a shortfall in the Hartfield accounts, from his salary, deferred sometimes against future quarters. From personal reserves she had not known he possessed. From the careful management of every penny he earned in 30 years of service, to a family whose patriarch had been gambling the estate into ruin while her father kept the books balanced and the tenants housed and the roof, what roof there was, over everyone's heads. £12,000, 30 years. And he had never told her the number. She sat with the ledger until the breakfast hour passed, and the candles she had lit against the early morning gray burned low and guttered. She did not eat. She did not send for Alistair. She turned pages and read her father's handwriting, the neat annotations, the occasional note in the margin. Once, in the 3rd year of the record, a single line that read, "The estate will hold if the accounts hold. I will hold the accounts." She read it 3 times, the morning after. She moved the trunk away from the east wing door and back to the wardrobe. She was not leaving. Not yet. There was too much she did not yet know what to do with. That same morning, in the estate office, she was reaching for the filing cabinet drawer when another hand reached for the same drawer, pull at the same moment. She withdrew her fingers. Alistair stood beside her, close enough that she could see the ink stain on his own cuff, a new one from this morning, which meant he had been writing, which was unusual. He looked at her hand. She had not thought about her hands since the ledger, and now she looked at them too. Ink stained to the 2nd knuckle, the evidence of 6 weeks of unassisted accounting work. He looked at the empty clerk's desk at the far end of the room. "How long has that position been vacant?" he asked. 6 weeks, Eleonora said. She pulled the file she needed and returned to her desk. He did not follow her, but she heard him cross the room and stand at the clerk's desk for a moment before he left. And she heard the particular quality of the silence he left behind him. The silence of a man who has just noticed something he should have noticed much sooner. Sophia Hale arrived at Hartfield on a Tuesday, which was, she told Alistair in the entrance hall, simply a social call. She wanted to see how her cousin was settled, to offer family warmth, to be useful in whatever small way she could. She wore a dress that had been made in London, and she brought a basket of sugared almonds for the cook. And within an hour, she had charmed every member of the household staff who was susceptible to charm, which was most of them. Eleonora watched from the doorway of the morning room as Sophia walked the garden with Alistair, gesturing toward the rose beds with the easy confidence of a woman who belonged in a landscape. She watched Sophia sit at the breakfast table the following morning, in Eleonora's chair, the one nearest the window, and pour tea for Alistair and laugh at something he said. And she watched Alistair receive this without correction. He did not say, "That is my wife's chair." He did not say anything at all. Eleonora observed this from the doorway for the length of time it took her to understand exactly what she was seeing. And then she returned to the estate office and opened the ledger and worked until luncheon, which she took alone at the writing desk. That evening, she brought the ledger to Alistair's study. She set it open on the desk in front of him, not handed to him, placed the way you place evidence before a court. And she stood on the other side of the desk and let him look at it. £12,000, she said. Your father gambled it away. Mine paid it back, year by year, over 30 years, from his own salary and savings and deferred wages. He covered the Hartfield accounts so that this estate, your title, your income, your standing in the county, would survive your father's habits. She waited until she was certain he had understood the figure. He told you at the deathbed that you owed him. He did not tell you how much, because he was a man who did not believe in making the people he served feel small. But I have the ledger now, and I am telling you the number. Alistair was looking at the pages. His expression had changed in a way she had not seen before, not the controlled contempt she had grown accustomed to, but something older and less defended. I did not know the amount, he said. No, you did not ask, because asking would have made the debt too large for your pride to carry. She kept her voice even, the voice she used for estate accounts and tenant disputes and every situation that required her to be precise rather than heard. You preferred to believe you were doing a kindness, marrying the steward's daughter out of obligation. It is a more comfortable story than the truth, which is that your family owes mine everything it still has, and that you have spent 2 years treating me as though I arrived here as a charity case rather than as the creditor's daughter. She closed the ledger, not sharply, but with finality. I am not asking you for an apology tonight. I am giving you the information you chose not to have. She picked up the ledger and left the study. Later, much later, past 10 o'clock, Alistair came to the estate office. Eleonora was still at the desk, working through a column of figures she had already checked twice, because the numbers gave her something to do with her hands. She did not look up when the door opened. She heard him cross the room, and then she heard nothing. And after a moment she realized he had not sat across from her, but rather closed the door, quietly, firmly, so that the servants passing in the corridor could not see in. She did not acknowledge it. She did not send him away. She bent over the accounts, and the candle burned between them, and the room held them both in its particular stillness. And outside the Hartfield windows, the midsummer night had finally gone dark. Lady Pembury's garden party was on a Thursday, and the rose beds were in full summer bloom, and 40 guests moved through the grounds in the particular performance of ease that the English gentry had perfected over centuries. Eleonora stood near the south wall, where the old climbing roses met the stone, a glass of lemonade in one hand, and the careful expression of a woman who has attended enough of these gatherings to know that stillness is its own kind of armor. She did not know precisely when Sophia's remark began to move through the party. She noticed it the way you notice a change in weather, a shift in how certain women looked at her, a conversation that stopped one beat too early when she approached. By the time she understood what had been said, 3 women near the fountain had looked at her and looked deliberately away, and Lady Radcliffe was nodding at something Sophia was telling her with the expression of a woman receiving confirmation of something she had long suspected. The marriage was arranged at a deathbed. The steward's daughter was installed as payment for a debt. Eleonora stood by the rose beds and felt the information settle over the party like weather. She watched the women near the fountain. She watched Sophia accept a glass of champagne from a passing footman with the composure of someone who has done what she came to do. She watched Alistair cross the lawn toward her, reading her face as he approached. "Go back to your guests," Eleonora said, before he could speak. He stopped. Something moved across his expression. Not the contempt she was accustomed to, but something that looked uncomfortably like concern. She did not want his concern. She wanted him to do what she asked. "Eleonora, please," she said. One word, flat and final. He went back to his guests. That night, alone with the ledger spread across the desk, Eleonora asked the empty room whether she had honored what her father gave her or simply survived it. The question had been forming since the moment she first opened the rosewood box. But it required the garden party, required the particular shame of standing in a public garden while her marriage was described as a transaction, to become a question she could say out loud. She spread all 30 years of her father's accounts across the desk, the full span of them, end to end. The early years when the shortfall was small, the middle years when the old Marquis's habits worsened and the figures grew. The final decade when her father's own health was failing and the numbers showed the strain of a man covering losses while his body was giving out beneath him. He had worked himself to the edge and beyond it, and he had done it so that she would have a home and a position and a name. She sat with those pages until past midnight, and she asked herself whether she had been worthy of the cost, and she did not have an answer that satisfied her. And she stayed until the candle burned down to a stub, because leaving the room felt like abandoning the question. The following afternoon, at the garden boundary wall, Eleonora stood with her hands flat on the stone and her face toward the fields and her thoughts in no particular order. She heard footsteps on the gravel behind her and did not turn. Alistair came and stood beside her at the wall, not touching, 5 inches of stone between his hand and hers. And neither of them spoke. After a long moment, she shifted 1 inch closer to him. He did not close the remaining gap. They stood there while the afternoon light moved across the fields, and the shadows lengthened toward the wall. And then, without a word, they went inside separately. Through different doors, Mr. Whitmore arrived on a Wednesday morning with a document case, and the careful expression of a solicitor who is carrying news he cannot predict the reception of. He asked to see Lord Hartfield privately, and Eleonora was in the estate office and heard none of it. What she learned when Alistair came to find her an hour later. He set a letter on her desk. Old paper, the ink brown with age. The handwriting she did not recognize until she read the salutation, "Hail," and understood that it was the old Marquis's hand. She read it. It was not long. It acknowledged, in the careful language of a man who had spent a lifetime not acknowledging things, that Thomas Hale's interventions had preserved the Hartfield estate during a period of significant financial difficulty. It stated, in the final paragraph, that the Marquis's son would do right by the Hale family. Eleonora set the letter down. He knew, she said. He answered quietly. Yes. He knew, and he wrote this letter. And then he continued. She looked at the paper. My father received this and kept working. 20 more years after this letter. He kept the accounts balanced, and he kept his own counsel, and he kept working. Eleonora? He never told me about the letter either. She pushed it back across the desk toward Alistair. Not angrily, but with the precision of a woman returning something that does not belong to her. He was a man who believed in letting people find their own way to what was right. He waited 30 years for your father to find it. He ran out of time. Alistair took the letter. He stood at her desk for a moment, and she watched him work through something. Not the barbed precision she was accustomed to, but something slower and less controlled. The expression of a man whose categories have been disrupted and who has not yet found new ones. He left without speaking. She returned to the accounts. The following week, Sophia called at Hartfield and asked to see Alistair privately. Eleonora was in the garden and did not know what was said until that evening, when Alistair came to the estate office with a particular set to his jaw and told her, "She presented me with an argument for annulment," he said. Eleonora set down her quill. "She said the marriage was arranged under duress," Alistair continued, "at a deathbed, that you had no real choice and I had no real freedom, and that the courts would understand. She made it sound reasonable." "And what did you say?" He was quiet for a moment. Then, "I asked her whether you had been installed here, or whether you were the only person who had made this estate function." Eleonora looked at him. "She didn't answer," he said. "No, she wouldn't." The silence between them had a different quality than their usual silences, less armored, more uncertain. Sophia had left, and the annulment proposal sat in the room between them like something that had been named and could not be unnamed. That night, Eleonora was in the estate office with one candle and the ledger open before her when Alistair came in and sat down. Not at the window, not in the doorway, but in the chair directly across the desk. The chair where clerks sat. The chair no one had voluntarily occupied in 6 weeks. He sat in it, and he looked at her across the candlelight, and she looked back. "You are not going to let her take this from you," he said. "Why not?" Eleonora asked. He opened his mouth. He closed it. He looked at the desk between them, the ledger, the accounts, the ink-stained edges of the quarterly reports, and he began a sentence and abandoned it, and began another and lost that one too. And she watched the articulate Marquess of Hartfield sit in the estate office chair and discover that the language he had built his life around had no words for what he was trying to say. She extended her hand across the desk, palm up. "Open." He looked at it for a moment. Then he reached across and took it, her ink-stained fingers in his, the ledger between them. 30 seconds. She felt the warmth of his hand and the particular weight of a man who is holding something carefully because he is afraid of what happens if he does not. Then she withdrew. She returned her hand to the ledger. She left the candle burning between them, and he did not move for a long time, and neither did she. Lord Radcliffe called at Hartfield on a Friday afternoon and asked to see Alistair alone. He brought a document case and the expression of a man who was performing a restitution. He had, he said, made certain inquiries. He laid the documents on the study table. Creditor records, correspondence, a summary prepared by a London inquiry agent. Sophia Hale carried £3,000 in London debts. Dressmakers, a jeweler, a moneylender on Chancery Lane whose rates were not the kind one discussed in company. Every visit she made here, Radcliffe said. Every whisper before the midsummer ball, including the one I repeated for which I owe you an apology. All of it traces back to the same point. She needed your money. She was using your marriage as a problem to be solved in her favor. Alistair read the documents twice. He read the creditor names and the specific amounts and the dates, which showed that Sophia's campaign had begun 6 months before the midsummer ball, long before Radcliffe's comment, which she had engineered precisely. "I need you to attend the harvest assembly," Alistair said, "and to bring this documentation." Radcliffe agreed without hesitation. That evening, Alistair went to the estate office and found Eleonora finishing the last of the quarterly reports. He told her he had asked Whitmore to bring the ledger and the old Marquis's letter to the harvest assembly. He did not explain what he intended to do with them. She looked at him across the desk. Her expression was not warm, and it was not cold. It was the expression of a woman who was deciding how much to trust a piece of information. She nodded and returned to the reports. The Hartfield Great Hall on Harvest Assembly evening held 40 guests and the expectation of a toast. The long tables had been set with autumn flowers, and the candles in the wall sconces burned high. And the room had the particular warmth of a gathering that believes it knows what is about to happen. Alistair rose when the room had settled. He held Thomas Hale's ledger in both hands. He did not open it immediately. He looked at the room, at Radcliffe near the east wall, at Whitmore standing to one side with his document case, at Sophia seated near the window in a dress that had been made in London, at Eleonora at the far end of the table, with her hands folded and her face composed and her eyes on him. "I am going to speak plainly tonight," Alistair said. "I ask your patience, because what I have to say is not short, and it is not comfortable." He named the £12,000 shortfall. He named his father's gambling, not euphemistically, not as financial difficulties or unfortunate habits, but as what it was: 30 years of a man who held a title and lost the income attached to it at cards and at dice, while his steward held the estate together with his own money and his own silence. He named Thomas Hale. He named the years. He named the figures. Mr. Whitmore stepped forward. In the measured tones of a man who has been a solicitor for 25 years and knows the weight professional authentication carries in a room, he confirmed the ledger's provenance. Thomas Hale's hand, verified against 30 years of estate correspondence. And then he opened his own document case and read the old Marquess's letter aloud. From Hale at the salutation to the final line about doing right by the family. The room was very still. Then Lord Radcliffe presented the documentation of Sophia's London debts. He named the creditors and the amounts. He named the timeline, the campaign that had begun 6 months before the midsummer ball. The whisper to Radcliffe himself that had been calculated to provoke exactly the humiliation it produced. He named it for what it was: a woman who needed a wealthy husband and had decided to create the conditions under which she might become one. Sophia stood. She opened her mouth. She said something about family concern and misunderstanding, and the particular vulnerability of a young woman in difficult circumstances, and every sentence she produced was technically true and entirely insufficient. And she sat back down. The room watched Alistair. He did not sit. He held the ledger in both hands, and he looked at the table for a moment. And when he looked up, his expression was the expression of a man who has decided to stop arguing with himself. "I have told this room that my marriage was an obligation," he said. "A debt. I have told anyone who asked, and many who did not, that I married Miss Hale because her father asked it on his deathbed, and the obligation was undeniable. That is half the truth." He paused. "The other half. I noticed her before the deathbed. When her father fell ill, the year before he died, she took over the management of this estate. I watched her run Hartfield, the accounts, the tenants, the repairs, the quarterly reports, with a competence that made me understand what it would mean if I lost it. I admired her before anyone asked me to marry her. The debt gave me permission to do what I already wanted to do without having to admit I wanted it. The room had the quality of a room in which everyone has stopped breathing. I have spent 2 years calling this marriage a burden. Alistair continued. And his voice was steady now, in the way that voices become steady when a man has finally stopped fighting himself. Because the alternative, saying plainly that I chose a steward's daughter because I wanted to, because I saw her before the deathbed, and she was the most capable person on my estate, and I was a coward about what that meant, was a sentence I could not say in any room I was raised to occupy. I said instead that I should have married her cousin. I said it in this county's hearing. I said it to her face. That is not the conduct of a man who was trapped by obligation. That is the conduct of a man who was frightened of what he chose and punished the woman beside him for making him feel it. He set the ledger on the table. I am naming it now, in this room, because she deserves to have it named. Eleonora stood. The room turned to her. She was not flushed, and she was not trembling. She stood the way she always stood, with the particular uprightness of a woman who has managed crises in this house for 2 years and knows that rooms respond to composure. Every day for 2 years, she said. I managed this house, these tenants, these accounts, and this family's reputation in the county. Not because I wanted approval, because the estate required someone competent, and I am my father's daughter, and competence was what I had to give. She let the room hear that sentence before she continued. You say you chose me. You say it now, in this room, which is the first time you have said it anywhere. Then carry my name. I want you to deliver my quarterly tenant reports. Every household on this estate, 47 doors. At each one, you will say who wrote the report, who arranged the repairs, who remembered the children's names. You will say it aloud, 47 times, until you have learned to say my name in the places where it has already been known for 2 years. She looked at him steadily. When you have done that, we will see whether you can say it in a room like this one. The room did not applaud. It watched. That was enough. 6 weeks, 47 doors. Alistair began the first week with 8 households. He rode out on a Tuesday morning with the quarterly reports in his saddlebag and a particular kind of discomfort that had no elegant name, and he delivered the first report to Mrs. Gregson at the North Farm and said what Eleonora had told him to say. Who had written the report? Who had arranged the March roof repair? Who had authorized it from the discretionary fund? Mrs. Gregson, who was 63 and had lived on Hartfield land her entire life, looked at him with the patience of a woman who has been waiting for a man to catch up to information she already possessed. I know, my lord, she said. Lady Hartfield came herself last month. She brought the repair invoice and stayed for tea and asked after my daughter's knee. He stood on the doorstep holding the quarterly report in both hands. He had ridden out to deliver information that the recipient already knew. The tenants had not been waiting for him to tell them Eleonora's name. They had known it for 2 years. The only person on the Hartfield estate who had not been saying it was the man who held the title. He rode to the next farm. In week 3, he reached the Alderton holding. The report he carried included a section in Eleonora's handwriting that the previous reports had not. A note about the eldest daughter, who had been feverish since the previous Tuesday. Sent broth and willow bark. Will check on Friday. He read the note on the doorstep after delivering the report and rode back to Hartfield without stopping at the remaining farms on his list. He found Eleonora in the estate office. "The Alderton girl," he said. "The fever. You sent willow bark." "On Tuesday," Eleonora said, without looking up from her work. "I did not know." "You did not ask." He set the report on her desk, not across from her, but beside her, where she could see it. "I am asking now. What else have I not asked?" She looked up then. She looked at him for a long moment, and he held that look without flinching, which was something he had not always been able to do. "Sit down," she said. "I will show you the correspondence file." He sat. She opened the file and walked him through 3 months of tenant communications. The illness records, the repair requests, the small interventions that did not appear in the formal accounts, but that constituted the actual management of 47 households. He read her handwriting for an hour. He asked questions, and she answered them. And it was the most direct conversation they had conducted in 2 years. And at the end of it, he understood that what she had built in this estate office was not merely competent. It was the kind of work that a person does when they have decided to belong somewhere, regardless of whether belonging has been offered to them. He returned to the deliveries. At the end of week 6, he came back from the final door and walked directly to the estate office. Eleonora was at the desk. She looked up when he came in. "All 47, he said, and they all knew, every one of them. He remained standing in the doorway for a moment, because sitting down felt presumptuous, and he had learned, over 6 weeks of doorsteps, a little about presumption. They knew your name and your handwriting and what you sent when the children were ill. They have known for 2 years. The only person on this estate who did not say your name was me." Eleonora set down her quill. "That is not an apology," she said. "That is an observation. It is a beginning." He crossed the room and stood at the edge of her desk. "May I sit?" She gestured to the chair beside her desk, not the clerk's chair across from it, but the second chair, the one that had not been there 6 weeks ago, the one that had appeared in the estate office sometime in the 3rd week of deliveries without either of them remarking on it. He sat. What had happened after the assembly, when the room had emptied and the candles had burned lower and the guests had found their wraps and their carriages, was this: Eleonora had walked to the estate office threshold, and he had followed, and she had turned and placed both hands flat against his chest, pressing the way you press a wall to test whether it will hold, and held them there for 5 seconds. She felt his heart. She felt him go very still. "You said you chose me," she said, "before the deathbed." He answered without hesitation. "Yes." "Then this is the first honest thing between us." She rose on her toes and kissed the corner of his mouth, not the center, the edge where words originate. She stepped back. "Learn to say the rest. Then you can have the rest." Now it was autumn. The Hartfield estate office held 2 chairs and 2 open ledgers, and the morning light came through the east window and fell across both desks. His ledger lay open beside hers, his column alignment corrected in her handwriting from the 4th week. A small, precise correction that he had not erased and did not intend to. He was reading tenant correspondence, a task she had assigned him in week 5. "Mrs. Gregson writes that the roof is holding," he said. He turned the letter. "She also writes that the Marquess visited on Tuesday and knew her name." He paused, underlined twice. Eleonora looked up from the accounts. "You knew her name," she said. "I have been learning names. It is harder than I expected. My father knew 300 tenants, every name, every household. I am at 47. He set Mrs. Gregson's letter on the correspondence pile and picked up the next. But I am starting. She returned to the accounts. He returned to the letters. The estate office where Thomas Hale had worked for 30 years and where his daughter had worked for 2 years unacknowledged, held them both in the autumn morning. 2 chairs, 2 ledgers, a man learning door by door and name by name that the woman beside him had never been the cost of a debt, but the reason anything still stood. Outside, the Hartfield fields were turning gold. The roof was holding, the accounts were balanced, and in the margin of his ledger, in handwriting he was beginning to recognize as his own improving attempt at her precision, he had written a single name at the top of the first page. Lady Eleanora Vane, Marchioness of Hartfield. He had written it there in week 4. He had not told her. She had seen it and said nothing. But he had noticed, the following morning, that she had left the ledger open on his side of the desk, open to that page, the name visible. And he understood that, as the answer it was.